From unsolved mysteries to unexplained phenomena, from comedy gold to relationship fails, Amazon Music's got the most ad-free top podcasts, included with Prime. Because the only thing that should interrupt your listening is, well, nothing. Download the Amazon Music app today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cracking open a pretty challenging stack of sources. We're trying to get at a really profound question. Why do political outcomes in the United States so often seem, well, disconnected from what most average citizens actually want or need financially?
Yeah, that feeling is common, isn't it? That sense of disconnect, like the whole system is maybe optimized for someone else entirely. That's really what we're digging into today.
We've got sources that mix current political science with some foundational sociological ideas, trying to explore the deep structural reasons behind political inequality.
Exactly. We're focusing on some classic theories of elite influence, but then applying them to something very current, very real, this massive piece of proposed legislation, the controversially named One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or H.R. 1, formally speaking.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want you to quickly and thoroughly grasp the sort of mechanisms behind political inequality.
Right. We want to understand why spending policies, and this isn't just recent, it's historical, across both main U.S. parties, why they so often seem to benefit the wealthy few.
And often, at the same time, impose real costs or limits on the middle and lower classes.
We're looking for those systemic barriers, the things that stop more equitable outcomes.
And we have to start with a really stark finding. It kind of sets the stage for everything else. It comes straight from the research, and it fundamentally challenges how we think about American democracy.
Which is,
statistically speaking, the policy preferences of the average American citizen have virtually zero discernible impact on actual policy decisions made in Washington.
Zero impact. That's the shocking claim we need to unpack. We're going to show you the data behind that.
Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start unpacking the structural problem. There was some really rigorous testing done by political scientists Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page. They basically tried to figure out who really holds the influence by testing 4 major theories of American politics against decades of actual policy data. How did they set that up?
Right. They systematically looked at policy outcomes and compared them against 4 competing explanations for who calls the shots in D.C.
Okay, what were the 4?
So the first 2 are what you might call the ideal theories, the majoritarian ones. First is majoritarian electoral democracy. This is the idea that policy basically reflects what the average citizen wants, mainly through elections. You vote, policy changes.
The textbook version, essentially.
Pretty much. The second is majoritarian pluralism. This suggests policy comes from a sort of balanced competition between different organized citizen groups, think unions, local associations, that kind of thing. Power is dispersed among groups.
Okay, those are the theories we usually learn about. What about the other 2 they tested? The less optimistic ones?
Well, the other 2 focus more on concentrated power. You have biased pluralism. This theory agrees that organized groups drive policy, but argues these groups are overwhelmingly skewed towards business interests and professional associations. Citizen groups are sort of left behind, disadvantaged.
So pluralism, but tilted.
Exactly. And the last one is economic elite domination. This theory is pretty blunt. It argues that policy is driven primarily, almost exclusively, by the preferences of the wealthy, the people at the very top of the income ladder.
All right, so they tested these 4 models against real-world policy data. Let's get to the results. Which models actually held up? This is where the debunking happens, right?
Yeah, and it was, devastating for those standard civics class ideals. Gilens and Page found basically no statistical support for either majoritarian electoral democracy or majoritarian pluralism.
None.
Essentially none. The data just doesn't show that policy decisions line up in any significant way with what average citizens prefer, whether those citizens are acting alone or trying to influence things through, say, non-economic interest groups.
So if the average American's opinion is, as they put it, statistically not distinguishable from zero in terms of impact, I mean, who is driving the bus in Washington then?
Okay, so according to their analysis, only 2 groups consistently showed a statistically significant and really disproportionate impact on policy outcomes.
And they are?
First, the policy preferences of affluent Americans. They define this as people in the 90th income percentile. So the economic elite. Their views mattered a lot. The wealthy.
And the second group?
Powerful interest groups. And critically, these were heavily weighted toward business interest, which supports that biased pluralism model too. But here's the key finding. When you statistically account for the preferences of the elites and these powerful interest groups, the apparent influence of the average citizen just vanishes. It drops to zero.
Wow. So the average person only seems to have influence if their preference happens to align with what elites or business groups already want?
That's what the data strongly suggests. And the quantitative success rate really drives this home. If a proposed policy change had support from either the economic elites or these powerful interest groups, its chances of actually becoming law shot way up.
How much did they go up? What were those numbers?
Well, the baseline probability of any random policy change happening was maybe around 16 to 18%, kind of low odds generally.
Okay.
But if economic elites supported a policy change, the probability jumped to 45%. If the organized interest groups supported it, it hit 47%.
Huge difference. And what if the average citizen supported something, but the elites or interest groups were against it?
Then it basically never happened. The policy process appears to be effectively dominated by economic elites and organized business, rendering mass preference kind of secondary at best, often irrelevant.
It's fascinating because this tendency for power to concentrate, it isn't just a modern American thing, is it? There was this sociologist, Robert Michels, over a century ago, who argued that this kind of elite rule, oligarchy, isn't some accident of democracy. He saw it as almost inevitable, a consequence of organization itself.
Absolutely. That takes us straight to Michels' iron law of oligarchy. And he framed it not so much as a political critique, but more like a cold, hard, sociological law, like gravity.
An iron law. So what's the law state?
Michels asserted that even in the most democratic or revolutionary political parties or organizations, democracy inevitably leads to oligarchy. There's always what he called a necessary oligarchical nucleus.
It contains the seeds of its own undoing, in a way. But what's the mechanism? Why does this happen? Is it just people getting greedy for power?
It's more structural than just greed, according to Michels. It's rooted in practical necessity. He argued that the sheer need for organization in any large group, you need specialized knowledge, administration, efficient communication, leadership, compels leaders to gain authority.
Because someone has to run things.
Exactly. And that specialization makes them indispensable. They know how the machine works. So they gradually shift from being servants of the group to becoming its masters, because they're the only ones who really understand the complex workings.
So the complexity of modern politics forces us to delegate power, and that very act of delegation starts to centralize it.
Precisely. And once leaders become specialized and indispensable, they find ways to hold on to power. Michels was very clear on this. And crucially, they work hard to maintain the appearance of democracy.
The illusion of control.
Right. The masses, Michels observed, often cherish the democratic forms of the voting, the rallies, the speeches, even when they're effectively being ruled by a small, privileged group.
And voting itself reinforces this illusion.
Yes. The citizen delegates authority, maybe thinking, I elected this person, they represent me. But functionally, sovereignty, the real power, has been handed over to the professional leadership of the organization.
This fundamental contradiction built into democratic organizing.
And Michel's also pointed out something else interesting. Sometimes leaders stay in power, not because they're particularly good or responsive, but simply due to what he called gregarious idleness, or the law of inertia among the members.
Meaning it's just easier to stick with who you know.
Yeah. It takes effort to organize opposition. So the existing leadership often stays, even if they now represent the past goals of the party, not the current will of the members. The organizational machinery just favors continuity.
That makes a lot of sense. The system protects itself. Okay, so Gillens and Page looked at overall policy outcomes. But another researcher, Larry Bartels, drilled down into specific congressional actions, didn't he? He looked at actual votes cast in the Senate.
That's right. Bartels' work gives us quantitative proof of this unequal responsiveness happening right inside Congress. He looked at roll call votes in the U.S. Senate, specifically in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
And these weren't obscure votes, right? They were on big contested issues.
Exactly. Things like minimum wage increases, civil rights legislation, debates over government spending levels, issues where you'd expect constituent preferences to matter.
So what did he find? How responsive were senators to different income groups within their own states?
Well, the pattern was incredibly stark, and it confirmed the elite dominance idea. Bartels found that senators' voting decisions were completely unresponsive to the policy preferences of the bottom third of their constituents based on income.
Completely unresponsive, zero effect.
Zero observable effect in the statistical analysis. The policy desires of the poorest third of their state's population had no measurable impact on how their senator voted on these key issues.
That's quite something. What about the other end, the wealthy?
That's where the influence was concentrated, the views of the upper third of the income distribution. Their preferences received about 50% more weight in predicting a senator's vote than the preferences of the group in the middle.
So the system isn't just passively reflecting elite views in broad outcomes, it's actively weighting the legislative process itself towards the preferences of the rich.
That's what Barkel's data indicated. Unequal representation is baked into the legislative voting patterns.
Okay, so we've established through Gillen's, Page, and Bartel's that elite preferences tend to dominate policy outcomes and even legislative votes. And Bichel's gave us a theory for why this happens structurally, the nature of organization. The next logical step seems to be, what do the wealthy actually want from government that's so different from the rest of the public? Where's the big disagreement?
Right. Understanding that policy preference gap is critical. Because if the elites drive policy, their specific preferences become the blueprint for legislation. And the data shows a pretty massive chasm, especially around the government's role in the economy.
Specifically things like budget deficits and the social safety net.
Exactly. The research shows wealthy Americans are consistently and often much more concerned than other Americans about budget deficits. Now, that concern itself isn't necessarily bad, but it has direct knock-on effects on their views about social spending.
And those effects lead them to favor cutting social programs. The data backs that up.
It does, very clearly. The wealthy are documented as being much more favorable toward cutting social welfare programs. The sources specifically mentioned Social Security and healthcare as prime targets for reduction from their perspective.
And conversely, when it comes to government actions aimed at helping lower and middle income folks get ahead or just stay afloat,
There, the wealthy are considerably less supportive. This includes things like wanting an above-poverty level minimum wage, ensuring a decent standard of living for the unemployed, or expanding things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. They tend to oppose those kinds of interventions.
this really isn't just a minor difference in emphasis, is it? It sounds like a fundamental disagreement about what government should even do. We should probably look at some specific numbers from the survey data, comparing the wealthy, that top 10%, with the general public. These figures really paint a picture of two different worlds.
Yeah, let's do that. Take maybe the most basic idea of a safety net. Should the government ensure people don't lack essentials? When asked if the government must see that no one is without food, clothing, or shelter, what did the public say?
68% of the general public agreed, a solid majority.
Right, but among the wealthy, that support dropped way down to 43%. That's a 25-point gap on whether the government has a basic responsibility for subsistence.
Okay, what about wages and jobs? The idea of a minimum wage high enough so a full-time worker isn't in poverty, that seems pretty popular generally.
Hugely popular. 78% of the general public favored that policy. Nearly 4 out of 5 people.
And the wealthy?
40%. Less than half of the economic elite surveyed believed a full-time job should guarantee an income above the poverty line.
Wow. Okay, one more. What about the government providing a decent standard of living for the unemployed?
General public, 50% support. The wealthy, only 23%.
And the broadest idea, government ensuring anyone who wants a job can find one.
Again, a huge gap. 68% of the general public supported this idea of the government as an employer of last resort, essentially. Among the wealthy, only 19%.
19%. That's almost a 50-point difference on a core economic security issue.
It's impossible to overstate how important this gap is, because if policy follows elite preferences, as Gillen's and Page showed, then legislation will structurally consistently favor things like deficit reduction and cutting welfare programs,
while actively blocking or discouraging things like higher minimum wages, unemployment support, and job programs that the vast majority actually want.
Precisely. It's a deep structural misalignment. And that misalignment, that gap between what the majority needs or wants and what the elite demands, translates directly into major legislation, which of course brings us to our case study.
Right, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or H.R. 1. This seems like a perfect contemporary example of how this elite preference gap gets encoded into law. When you look under the hood, it seems to show that systematic cost-shifting mechanism benefits flow upwards, funded by cuts or limits placed on programs for everyone else.
Exactly. And you don't just have to take our word for it. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they analyzed the expected financial impact. Did their forecast confirm this skew towards the wealthy?
Oh, absolutely. They estimated that H.R. 1 would skew pretty heavily toward the wealthy. But it wasn't just that the rich did better. They projected that low earners would actually be definitively worse off.
Worse off. Not just left behind, but actually losing ground.
Yes. The CBO forecast specifically stated that income for the bottom 10% of households would likely fall by 2% in 2027 and then fall even further by 4% in 2033 as a direct result of the changes in this bill.
So the poorest Americans see their incomes decline, even as the overall economy might be growing. And how is that possible? How does the bill achieve that?
Well, the mechanism described is that the massive tax cuts in the bill, estimated at $4 trillion or potentially more, are paid for, at least partially, by reductions to social safety net programs.
There it is. That's the policy preference gap in action, right in the federal budget. The poor and vulnerable effectively subsidize tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy.
Let's look at some specifics, because the mechanisms can be pretty technical, buried deep in the tax code changes, things clearly designed to benefit large corporations. Take Section 70321 of the Act.
Okay, yeah, that one's dense. Let's try to translate it. What does it do?
So Section 70321 significantly increases the tax deduction a U.S. corporation can take for two specific kinds of foreign income. First, for something called Foreign-Derived Deduction Eligible Income, or FDDEI. Think of this basically as income from exporting goods or services. The deduction goes up to 33.34%.
So a bigger tax break on profits from exports. And the second part.
The second part increases the deduction for what's called net CFC-tested income. This used to be known as GILTI, Global Intangible Low-Taxed Income. It raises that deduction to 40% starting in 2026.
Okay, stop there. Why do these technical terms, FDDEI, GILTI, why do bigger deductions for them matter so much? Who benefits?
They matter hugely because they are massive tax breaks, primarily benefiting multinational corporations. Increasing the FDEI deduction makes it much cheaper tax-wise to earn profits overseas from exports. Increasing the GILTI deduction significantly lowers the U.S. tax bill on a huge chunk of foreign profits held by U.S. companies' foreign subsidiaries. These are complex, multi-billion-dollar giveaways targeted squarely at the economic elite operating globally.
Right, so huge breaks for global corporations. Now, contrast that with how the bill handles things like charitable giving for individuals. There was a sort of push and pull there, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's interesting. It uses kind of a carrot and stick approach.
Yeah.
Section 70424 increases the standard charitable deduction for people who don't itemize their taxes. That might offer a small benefit to some middle-class donors.
Okay, a small carrot. What's the stick?
The stick comes in Section 70425. It imposes a brand new floor, a limitation, on itemized charitable contributions. You can only deduct the amount of your charitable giving that exceeds 0.5% of your adjusted gross income, your AGI.
Ah, so for many people who do itemize, maybe upper middle class folks, this new floor actually reduces the tax benefit they get from their regular charitable giving. It claws back a common deduction.
Exactly. And at the same time, the bill does something else. Section 70423 permanently extends the new markets tax credit. Now, this is framed as helping investment in low-income communities, but these types of credits often function in practice as complex tax shelters or incentives for specific kinds of large-scale investments favored by high-net-worth individuals and financial institutions. It's another targeted benefit for certain types of capital, while broader deductions are trimmed.
So, targeted benefits for some elite activities balanced against broader pain elsewhere. And that pain seems most acute when you look directly at the cuts to programs for lower-income citizens. The changes to food assistance, SNAP, seem like a prime example of using subtle administrative tweaks to cut spending.
Yeah, explain the SNAP freeze mechanism. How does that work?
So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP food stamps the bill, effectively cuts future benefits by freezing the baseline amount recipients can get. Crucially, it prevents the government from updating the Thrifty Food Plan.
And the Thrifty Food Plan is?
That's the official estimate of a bare-bones nutritious diet cost. It's the benchmark used to calculate SNAP benefit amounts. Normally, it gets updated periodically to reflect rising grocery prices.
But this bill freezes it, so as food prices inevitably go up,
The actual purchasing power of the SNAP benefit goes down every single year. It's a hidden cut delivered structurally through inflation, hitting the poorest families directly in their grocery budget.
that's brutal. And the bill also seems to restrict how states themselves can fund their own health programs for the poor, specifically Medicaid.
Yes, it limits a common financing mechanism. Many states use what are called provider taxes. They tax hospitals or clinics, generate revenue, and then use that state revenue to draw down much larger amounts of federal matching funds for their Medicaid programs. It's a way to leverage state money to get more federal dollars for healthcare.
And H.R. 1 restricts that.
It restricts the ability of states to use these provider taxes quite as effectively to generate additional federal funding in the future. It essentially caps potential Medicaid funding growth from this source, squeezing state budgets and limiting their flexibility to provide health care, especially for states mentioned like Maine that relied on this.
Okay, we also see cuts in the environmental area. Sections 60010 and 6011 take back, or rescind, funding already allocated to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. What was that money originally for?
This was funding specifically aimed at improving transparency and standardization around corporate climate promises, when companies pledge to reduce emissions. It was also for developing clear standards for the environmental impact of construction materials.
So taking back that money basically reduces environmental oversight and slows down efforts to hold corporations accountable on climate change.
Pretty much. It aligns perfectly with the likely preferences of large industrial or energy corporations who might resist that kind of scrutiny or standardization.
Let's pivot quickly to agriculture and education. Section 10301 deals with farm subsidies, commodity support programs like PLC, ARC, and DMC. What's the main change there?
The bill extends these programs, but critically, it increases the official reference prices used to calculate payments through 2031.
And higher reference prices mean?
It means government payments to farmers are triggered more easily, and the payments themselves are likely to be larger when they're triggered. It's a significant boost to agricultural subsidies. And like many subsidies, critics often point out, they tend to disproportionately benefit larger, wealthier farm operations and landowners, not necessarily small family farms.
Okay, and on education, there's a really tricky dynamic with Pell Grants for college students. The bill adds $10.5 billion for Pell Grants in FY 2026, which sounds good on the surface.
But there's a catch, right? Section A33004 introduces a new restriction.
Exactly. It creates this kind of eligibility trap. A student actually becomes ineligible for their federal Pell Grant if their non-federal grant aid money they get from their state, their college, or private scholarships adds up to equal or exceed their total cost of attendance.
Wait, so it penalizes the students who are most successful at patching together aid from multiple sources. The neediest students who hustle to get state and institutional grants.
That seems to be the effect. If they manage to get enough other aid to cover their full costs, the federal government pulls back its Pell Grant. It essentially caps their total aid package, potentially making it harder for the highest need students to actually afford to go.
That seems counterproductive. And the bill also tries to regulate what kind of programs students can even enroll in using federal funds. Section 8401 the low-earning outcome programs.
Right. This prohibits colleges and universities, what they call IHEs, from using federal student aid money for enrollment in programs where graduates, on average, end up earning less than someone with just a high school diploma.
So targeting vocational programs, maybe at community colleges.
It could certainly put pressure on those types of programs, especially those serving lower-income communities where even a small earnings gain might be significant. It forces institutions to prioritize the potential future earnings of graduates, possibly over access or serving specific community needs. It's framed as accountability, but the impact could be complex.
And finally, just to round out the picture, the bill introduces new fees or increases existing ones, specifically targeting vulnerable immigrant groups.
Yeah, sections 104 through 107 set new minimum fees, like a $1,000 minimum fee for non-U.S. nationals paroled into the country, a $250 minimum for kids applying for special immigrant juvenile status, and raising the maximum fee for temporary protected status applications to $500.
So these aren't broad-based taxes. They're specific fees levied on populations seeking legal status or protection, people who generally have the least ability to absorb new costs. It's another way of shifting burdens downward.
Absolutely. So when you step back and look at all these pieces together, the huge corporate tax cuts, the boost to farm subsidies, contrasted with the SNIP freeze, the Medicaid limits, the Pell Grant trap, the new fees on immigrants, and the overall pattern of the legislation seems to perfectly mirror that policy preference gap we talked about. It really does look like economic elite domination theory playing out in legislative text.
It's a compelling case study, showing how those abstract theories manifest in the real world, impacting millions of lives.
Okay, so if these legislative outcomes aren't just random, but seem structurally tilted towards oligarchy, what does this say about our political system itself? Michel's argued that this concentration of power, the rise of privileged minorities, happens even in places like the U.S. without official titles of nobility. He blamed capitalist concentration, the sheer power of millionaires, the railway kings of his time.
And he saw political parties, even democratic ones, as actually accelerating this process.
Yeah.
Leaders get elected, yes, but they quickly become indispensable because they run the party machinery. That indispensability, combined with, let's be honest, basic human ambition or greed for power, just speeds up the development of what he called democratic oligarchy. The structure itself favors power consolidation at the top.
And this tendency seems like it would be particularly strong in a two-party system like the U.S. has. If voters can't reliably shift policy through elections alone, as Gillens and Page suggest, maybe they could hope for change through internal party competition. But you're saying the leadership structure often works to suppress that kind of internal dissent.
That's exactly Maisel's point. Once a leadership group is entrenched, holding the levers of power within the party, they wrap themselves in what he called an aureole of legality. They start using these grand, self-justifying phrases, "we must act for the general interest," or "we need to maintain party discipline."
Phrases that sound reasonable on the surface.
Right. But they're often used, Michels argued, to shut down opposition. Anyone questioning the leadership gets painted as an enemy or an intriguer, someone trying to selfishly disrupt party unity. The elite's priority becomes preserving their own position and the party's cohesion, often over-adapting to what the members might actually want at that moment.
So, if the standard democratic process, especially within parties, seems to lead towards this kind of organizational oligarchy, what can be done? Do these sources offer any alternative solutions? We probably need to look beyond just tweaking elections, right? We need more fundamental structural changes to counterbalance this power concentration.
Yes, and the sources do suggest some pretty radical structural alternatives, moving far beyond just voting differently. One comes from the economist Joseph Schumpeter, who was thinking about the sheer complexity of running a modern industrial state.
Okay. What was Schumpeter's idea?
Schumpeter argued that for democracy to even function effectively in a complex nation, you need a strong bureaucracy, not just efficient and competent, but strong enough to actually guide and instruct the politicians.
Wait, that sounds counterintuitive to a lot of American political thinking, which often distrusts bureaucracy. Why did Schumpeter think a powerful, independent bureaucracy was necessary?
Because he saw the political class, the elected officials, as often being driven by short-term election cycles, by emotions, maybe even by irrationality. The state, however, needs long-term thinking, technical expertise, and continuity to manage complex things like the economy, international relations, or intricate regulations.
So the bureaucracy acts as a kind of ballast.
Kind of. Schumpeter proposed that this expert bureaucracy needs to develop its own internal principles, its own professional ethics, and be largely independent from the whims of elected politicians. He thought it should mostly manage its own appointments, promotions, and standards based on expertise and merit, insulating the actual running of the state from the political chaos.
That's a really profound idea that the very institution often seen as the problem might actually be a necessary counterweight to the potential instability of purely political rule. Okay, what other structural alternatives are proposed to fight back against these financial and electoral oligarchies we see reflected in things like H.R. 1?
Another major thinker, Gaetano Mosca, offered a different remedy. He was focused on mitigating what he saw as the evils of parliamentarism, essentially, the corrupting influence of centralized legislative power. His solution was radical decentralization.
Decentralization, we hear that word a lot. But what did Mosca mean specifically? Just giving more power to local governments?
It was more fundamental than that. Yes, transferring functions away from central bureaucracies and the national parliament to local assemblies was part of it. But critically, Mosca envisioned cultivating and empowering a large class of what he called public-spirited citizens.
Public-spirited citizens. Who are they?
He described them as people who were often educated, perhaps independently wealthy, generally superior in ability, and crucially, independence. These are people who might otherwise avoid getting involved in the muck of national politics.
So the idea is to draw these capable, independent elites into local governance, giving them real power there.
Exactly. By giving them meaningful roles and authority at a decentralized level, you create a powerful organic counterbalance to the centralized bureaucratic, financial, and electoral oligarchies that tend to dominate the national capital. It dilutes the power concentrated at the very top by creating strong, independent power centers elsewhere.
It's like creating a distributed network of local power to check the central machine.
That's a good way to put it. It harnesses capable people who wouldn't play the national game. But even these kinds of major structural changes face a deep sociological challenge, something Michel's identified and called the tragic destiny.
The tragic destiny. That sounds ominous. What is it? The idea that fighting the system inherently corrupts the fighters?
Pretty much. It's the ultimate catch-22, especially in class struggle, Michel's argued. Take the conflict between labor and capital. The working class works hard to elevate its smartest, most capable, most articulate leaders.
Their best hopes for change.
Right. But what happens to those individuals once they achieve success, gain influence, maybe even enter the halls of power? They become, in Michel's term, deproletarianized. Their social status changes, their interests might shift, they get assimilated into the very system they were supposed to challenge.
Or if not them, then maybe their children.
Exactly. Social success tends to alter political loyalties over time, making it incredibly difficult to maintain a truly revolutionary or purely representative leadership that doesn't eventually become part of the oligarchy itself. The system has a way of absorbing its most effective potential opponents.
The machine co-ops its critics. Wow. And finally, Mosca also left us with a pretty stark warning about going too far in the other direction, towards a collectivist state, as a potential alternative to capitalist oligarchy.
Yes, Mosca was very concerned about that. He cautioned that if a society were completely reorganized along collectivist lines, the problems of inequality and unaccountable power wouldn't disappear. In fact, they might present themselves in an even graver form.
Why graver?
Because in such a system, the rulers wouldn't just have political power, they would also control all economic power. They would literally control the means of production, distribution, everything. This would allow them to dictate the fate of every single individual in every aspect of life, piling economic control on top of political control.
Concentrating power even more, absolutely.
Exactly. Mosca concluded rather soberly that, at the end of the day, money and soldiers, economic resources, and coercive force remain the most reliable instruments for wielding power. A collectivist state, he feared, simply concentrates both of those instruments fully and completely in the hands of the ruling minority, potentially leading to an even more oppressive form of oligarchy. So to kind of pull all this together, what we've really uncovered today is that policy outcomes, when you look closely at the data like Gallons and Page did, or specific legislation like the OBBBA, seem to align remarkably well with these theories of political oligarchy. The evidence suggests elite preferences, particularly economic elites, disproportionately shape the laws.
Yeah, and Bartels showed that inequality is reflected even in Senate voting patterns.
Right, and Michaels provides that theoretical backbone, arguing that the structure of democracy and organization itself, the need for leaders, for specialization, inherently contributes to this consolidation of power. It's almost like organization, a practical necessity, contains the seeds of oligarchy within it.
So we've established pretty clearly, based on these sources, that the average citizen's preferences often appear statistically irrelevant to national policy. We've seen how this plays out in major legislation, shifting costs and benefits, and we've also looked at some pretty radical structural remedies proposed by thinkers like Schumpeter and Mosca, things like a powerful independent bureaucracy or massive decentralization. These aren't minor tweaks, they're fundamental shifts in how power is organized.
Absolutely. These sources don't offer easy answers. They really just highlight deep, systemic challenges baked into modern governance.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final, difficult question to ponder. If the modern democratic process, as some of these thinkers argue, ultimately gives the electorate mainly just the choice of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them.
And if that bureaucratic or oligarchical pendency really is a kind of technical necessity for any large-scale organization to function,
then what is the most realistic path forward? How can we ensure that the laws being passed actually reflect the needs and the financial security of the majority? What kind of fundamental organization, maybe something outside traditional parties, something non-electoral, might be needed to effectively counterbalance that indispensable core of power that always seems to aggregate at the top?
Something to think about. Until next time.